Hi, I'm Laura McMahon-Higgins. Welcome back to Nasty or Necessary, the series where we examine common clauses from commercial construction contracts and answer the question, is it necessary or just plain nasty? Today we are going to look at clauses which state that in the event of a discrepancy, the more onerous obligation takes precedence. In order to do this, we need to remember that a construction contract will generally include a lot of different parts: an instrument of agreement, general conditions, special conditions, a scope of work, a specification, and drawings. And that's just the beginning. Now, it's common for these documents to conflict each other, which creates an ambiguity within your contract. Before we look at the clause in question, let's discuss how ambiguity is usually dealt with. Generally, what a contract will do is assign all those different documents an order of precedence. Then, if there's a conflict or ambiguity between two documents, the contractor must inform the principal. The principal will then instruct the contractor which document to follow. If the principal's instruction applies the order of precedence, the contractor must follow the direction at its own cost. But if the instruction mixes up the order of precedence, then the contractor must still follow the direction, but it's entitled to claim a variation for any cost it incurs as a result of following that instruction. This is considered to be a fair position. If the scope of work outranks the specification, a contractor just has to be satisfied that they have very thoroughly checked the scope and priced it correctly. Then, if we later find that there is a conflict between the scope and the specification, the contractor will be entitled to claim any cost it incurs in complying with the spec rather than the scope it priced. Now, a more onerous obligation clause is going to change that practice. This is what the clause will look like. In the event an inconsistency, ambiguity, or discrepancy relates to the required quality or standard of the works, the contractor shall, at its own cost, comply with the highest quality or standard specified, or perform the more onerous obligation. What this means is that in the event of any conflict, the more onerous obligation takes precedence. So for one issue, the scope outranks the spec, but in another issue, the spec outranks the scope. That may not sound too nasty, but let's look at how this can play out in real life. Let's imagine the scope says the contractor must construct driveways using a 100mm concrete slab with standard reinforcing mesh. But the specification says all hard surfaces surrounding the building must be able to withstand heavy vehicle loads. The conflict isn't easy to identify, but it's there. A 100mm slab cannot handle heavy vehicle loads, it will crack. So to meet the specification, a thicker slab with a heavier reinforcement will be needed. If the more onerous obligation takes precedence, the contractor is going to have to provide the thicker slab at its own cost. Now, what this means practically is that it's really difficult for a contractor to price, as there's often insufficient time in a tender process to triple check every line item of the spec to ensure it complies with the scope, particularly at a subcontractor level, where your scope of work is individual to you, but the specification often covers multiple subcontract packages. For that reason, this clause weighs in at nasty. Now, for my principals, please be aware that contractors price against this risk and they price heavily. So be sure that you really need these clauses before you just sprinkle them through your contracts, because it will affect your project pricing. That wraps up this episode of Nasty or Necessary. If you found this helpful, please sign up to complete our online training course today, or reach out to us and request advice. Questamon Legal specialise in construction law. If you need me, you know where I am.